Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. You're listening to IXIATalks, Episode 3. My name is Sydney Jones, and I'm the Head of Marketing Communications here at IXIASOFT. I'll be your host. IXIATalks is a webinar series that covers DITA, Agile Document Management, localization, IXIASOFT's very own CCMS, and more. Episodes are released periodically and cover a wide range of topics in the TechCom industry. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping details. This webinar is being recorded. We'll send you a link to the recorded version after it airs. As audience members, you're muted, so don't worry if we can't hear you. Finally, if you would like to ask a question during the webinar, please type it into the questions section of your control panel in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, and we will answer these questions during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Our special guest today is IXIASOFT's own DITA Specialist Leigh White. Hello, Leigh.
Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are, and thanks for joining us today. Over the next hour, I'm going to explain what a content inventory and audit are, what the difference between the two is, why you should do both, and offer a simple example using sample content to help you get started with your own inventories and audits. So let's get started.
So the first question we need to answer is, what is a content inventory and audit? You probably have a pretty good idea just from the names, but let's formalize the definitions a little bit. Leigh, can you help us out?
Sure. The differences between a content inventory and audit are important. The content inventory is, at its simplest, a list of what you have, your maps, topics, images in a DITA model, or your HTML files, or your Microsoft Word documents, or your Adobe FrameMaker books and files, and so on. It lists file names, titles, cross-references, images used, things like that. It's quantitative. Now, imagine that you have a spare room in your house that contains your very large DVD collection. You've acquired these DVDs over many years from many sources. Now you need to convert the spare room into a bedroom or a den, so you need to reduce the size of the DVD collection. You probably start going through the shelves, looking at each DVD and removing the ones you don't want to keep, putting them into a box for storage or donation at your next yard sale. So what does a DVD collection have to do with your content? A lot, actually. For one thing, by going through those DVDs, you've just performed a very simple content audit. You've evaluated each DVD for its value and worth to you and decided whether to keep it or discard it. That is the heart of a content audit, but of course, there's a lot more involved. Much like your DVD collection, a content set grows organically over time. It's created over many years by many writers, with many different writing styles and degrees of detail. In many cases, the content creators are no longer part of your company, but their content lives on. It's possible the content is in different formats destined for print or online outputs, or is maintained in multiple proprietary tools such as Microsoft Word or Adobe FrameMaker or InDesign. Beyond this, there could be a wealth of useful information within the company that the documentation group doesn't maintain or even know about. It's not uncommon for support teams and trainers and technicians to have lots of tips and tricks, documents that really should be included in the mainstream documentation.
So in a sense, you're kind of having to play content sleuth and track down everything that needs to be involved in the scope of the inventory. Leigh, what should that scope be exactly?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So let's take a few minutes and talk about that. There are many reasons to do a content inventory and audit. Some of the most common reasons are a cleanup before converting your content from one format to another. For example, before a conversion to DITA. A cleanup before moving your content into a CCMS. A cleanup to reduce the cost of localization. Notice that cleanup is the common factor here. So just like that DVD collection, an organically grown content set must be thinned out periodically. Ideally, that should happen on a regular basis, but we're all busy. It's hard to find the time to clean up when you constantly have updates and new documentation to deliver. As a result, it's only when some major tool or process change is about to happen that we are forced to make the time to clean up. So most content inventories and audits are driven by a specific purpose. If you're moving your content into a CCMS, for example, you'd probably like to make a fresh start and not import outdated or redundant content. You can import everything and clean up later, if that better fits your timeline. Or you can clean up first and do a nice, efficient import. Here's a subtle hint. Clean up first before you import. It's a lot easier to do that kind of thing in a file system than it is once everything is in a CCMS. Now, there probably aren't two options before or after with localization. Localization costs money. Updating translation memories costs money. Even evaluating content for changes costs money. You don't want to send outdated or redundant content to your translation vendor only to clean up later, send the streamlined content, and have to pay again for translation memory updates. It's obviously better to clean up first in this case, and even more so if you're combining localization with a conversion to DITA, for example. The point is, the cleanup has to happen sometime. The sooner, the better. And the first step in figuring out what to keep and what to discard and what to refactor is to create a list of what you have. That list, simply put, is your content inventory.
So there's one more reason you might want to do a content inventory and audit, and this reason is specific to IXIASOFT's CCMS feature called Dynamic Release Management, or DRM.
Right. So DRM is a robust version control feature. You organize your content into multiple product and library versions, which can be dependent on each other, ensuring that the maps, topics, and images that you use in a deliverable are all the appropriate versions for that deliverable, and that outdated or future information doesn't slip in. Because of the high degree of dependency between the versions in DRM, you need a detailed picture of your content to know which product and library versions each map, topic, and image should be placed into initially. This ensures objects that need to be used together can be used together. So do I even need to say, here's another subtle hint, clean up before you implement DRM? So we talked about the inventory. Now, the content audit is an evaluation of each item in the inventory. So for each item in the inventory, you want to make a value judgment on it. Yes, that's right. You totally get to judge your content here. And you want to judge it by 5 basic criteria. Is it relevant? Does it add value for the user? Is it accurate? Is the information factually correct? Is it complete? Is all the necessary information present? Is it conformant? Does it adhere to authoring, style, structure, and terminology standards? And is it unique? Is it a duplicate or a near duplicate of another item in the inventory? Let's call these criteria RACU just to have a catchy acronym. If the answer to any of these questions is no, then you need to decide what action to take on the item.
So Leigh, how can you determine these criteria, these RACU criteria, especially the fuzzy ones like relevance?
Relevance is the most tricky because it is more of a qualitative judgment. If you're analyzing website or responsive web help content, hopefully you have the capability to run analytics. This at least tells you which pages or topics are getting the most and fewest hits, and that's a good clue as to what is the most relevant. If you don't have the capability to run analytics and you don't get much feedback from your users, and if you don't, you are far from alone, then maybe you can get some help from your internal users, such as a support team or technicians, and they can tell you what they have found helpful or less than helpful about your documentation. And as you go through your content, you'll probably find errors and issues that you need to correct. Make a list of these. Chances are you'll start to see patterns. You'll find the same things occur again and again. And this list can also serve as a good predictor for what kinds of things are likely to occur in new content going forward, because people get in their habits and they make the same mistakes predictably. I'll tell you in a few minutes what you can use that list for.
It seems like you need a high level of organization and focus to get your content inventory and audit in gear. Do you have suggestions for keeping organized during this process?
Absolutely. A project plan is essential. The content inventory and audit should absolutely be non-negotiable items in the overall project that's serving as a motivation, such as the conversion to DITA or the purchase of a CCMS or the implementation of DRM. It can't just be a sideline item. It's really got to be a firm part of the overall project. Now, what should the project plan include? Well, to start, you need a goal statement. It could look something like this. To first inventory our current body of content for product group, business unit, etc., to create a comprehensive list of current items and their relationships to each other. To then evaluate each item in the inventory to analyze and resolve gaps, redundancies, and inconsistencies, resulting in a clean body of content that reduces the cost and time for conversion to DITA, CCMS implementation, localization, etc. So once you know firmly what you want to accomplish, then you can start accomplishing it. So your inventory process, ask yourself questions like, will it be compiled manually? Will you require scripts or tools? If so, who is responsible for developing and testing the scripts or choosing, purchasing, implementing, and testing the tools? How will the audit happen? Do you already have the standards in place for evaluating the content for RACU? If not, who will develop these standards? Is there sufficient time built into the project for all of these things? How will you manage ongoing work and deliveries against the content updates you're making? Will you deliver hybrid content? When should all these tools and scripts be in place and functional? When should the evaluation standards be finalized? When should each writer or teams or products inventory be finished? When will the audit be completed? So this is a ton of questions to ask yourself, and this isn't all of them. Of course, there's more, but this is just a taste of the things you need to ask yourself. But don't be intimidated by all of these questions. Understand that the content inventory and audit require careful and thoughtful planning, just like any large project. You just need to think about everything that needs to happen, the timeline it's going to happen along, and who will be responsible for doing each of those things. It's a project inside of a project, really.
And milestones are an important part of any project as well. How does that come into play here?
Well, again, the milestones you need to know, when will you be done with everything? So your overall project plan, let's say it's a conversion to DITA. If you have determined that you need X amount of time for your conversion, you also need to know how much time you're going to need for the inventory and whether these things can happen side by side, or if the inventory needs to be fully complete before you can even start the conversion. So for example, you may be able to inventory one sort of self-contained group of content, start the conversion on that while continuing to inventory another part of that content. So you need to decide, when should everything be done, and once this step is done, can you move on to the part of your actual project, or do you have to finish the whole inventory at once?
So how do you keep your content nice and clean, not just at the onset, but long term?
Well, you have to do future content audits. So a periodic re-inventory and audit. You can't just take it for granted that once you've got it clean, it'll stay clean. I mean, once you clean your house, it doesn't stay clean. You have to keep cleaning it, But hopefully once you've done the big, deep clean, then you can just do surface cleaning for a while. So I can hear you all groaning now. That the inventory is so much work and then we have to do it again. Well, yes, you do. Not to the depth that you did your original inventory and audit, but yes, you can think of it as an annual checkup. This kind of periodic re-inventory and re-audit is called a rolling audit because it's not a stop the presses kind of event, but rather it's a mini snapshot of just the content that's most likely to have deviated from your RACU standards. And how do you know what content that is? Well, you earmark it during your comprehensive inventory and audit. So these rolling audits should be done at regular intervals, not necessarily calendar intervals, but at milestones in your documentation or release process, such as after each major release or publishing cycle. For starters, check all the new content that was created or changed since the last audit. Obviously, that's where errors could have been introduced. And also review your list of at RACU risk content and pay special attention to that. And I cannot stress enough that if you're going to do a content inventory and audit, you should really have this book here. It is a must-have resource. It is really a wealth of information about the whole inventory and audit process. It provides many more details about everything I've covered here. It also has helpful checklists and flowcharts, things that you can adapt for your own needs, and a lot of more resources. It's a very small book, deceptively small, but it is a really invaluable resource for content inventories and audits.
So now that we have some background info on content inventories and audits, I'll switch the screen over to Leigh here. So she'll be showing you an example of a real inventory and audit. Now, this Excel spreadsheet is also available in the handout section of your attendee control panel, so just keep an eye out for that.
Okay, great. I hope everybody's seeing the spreadsheet here. It's a kind of orange and white striped thing. So this is an example of a combination inventory and audit spreadsheet. And this is totally my invention. It's not official or anything like that. And the content shown here is the database documentation for a fictitious product called Thunderbird. It was originally sponsored by the consulting firm Gnostics Research and includes contributions from Joe Gallner, Jackie Samuels, and several other people. It's freely available from GitHub at the link that is included in the slides. And it's a great resource for presentations like this, or really anytime you need realistic sample content. So notice that this spreadsheet is specific to DITA content because that's what Thunderbird is. And that's what we specialize in here at IXIASOFT. If your content is not DITA, then you'll need different columns or other columns in addition to this. For example, you might want to record text insets or snippets or frame books and so forth. I do apologize in advance for the DITA terminology I'm about to use for those of you who might not be familiar with DITA. But do please understand that the principles I'm talking about in this webinar apply to any kind of content, not just DITA content. So terminology aside, you can take these forward with anything. In this particular spreadsheet, file names are listed multiple times because there's one line per item for that file, such as key refs or conrefs or where used, etc. And this just enables the spreadsheet to be sorted on any column, and you always have the file name as a reference for what object you're referring to, no matter how you sort it. So the first few columns, as I'll scroll across here, are the inventory portion of the spreadsheet through type here. They simply record objective facts about the content, like the title, the file name, the object type. Notice that some titles do use a key, And I have noted that with square brackets. You can use any notation you like. Now, this is not an especially sophisticated spreadsheet, I will admit. You may have a spreadsheet guru, which I am not, on your team, who can come up with something much spiffier than this. Or you might choose to use something other than a spreadsheet for recording your inventory and audit results. Take advantage of whatever people and tools you have at your disposal for this. So after the first few inventory columns, we get into some more detailed information about each object. In particular, its relationship to other objects. So for example, where used and keywords and cross-refs from and to and key refs, con refs, things like that. This is the kind of information you absolutely need if you're planning to implement DRM within the IXIASOFT CCMS. But it's good information to record in any case. There are many, many other uses for it. And let me quickly point out a few things from this inventory as examples of what you can discover. Now, I was not at all familiar with the Thunderbird content when I did this inventory. So I found a few things that I would want to pay attention to if I were redoing or cleaning up this content. So notice that there's one JPEG image, for example. That's this A_warning icon.jpg. All the rest of the images are PNG. Well, that may or may not be an issue, but if you're trying to be consistent in your image formats and just use, one raster format and one vector format, for example, then you might want to convert this image to a PNG. But you wouldn't necessarily know that this was lurking in your content unless you had done an inventory. Also, for images, as a side note, you might choose to record the nature of the image rather than its file type or in addition to its file type. For example, images can be screenshots, schematics, diagrams, flowcharts, equations, and so forth. Many CCMSs, including IXIASOFT, allow you to distinguish between image types. So it's useful to record that information. In addition, you might have low resolution and high resolution copies of a single image. So be sure to record that information as well. Now, as I scroll down a little bit here, you'll notice that the title case is not necessarily consistent. So for example, I have common tasks, which is initial caps. And then I have all of these others up here, attribute and parameter syntax, flow rate, capacity, and so forth, which are sentence case. So again, you probably want to be consistent with that, and you might not discover this without doing an inventory. So whatever your style guide dictates, you'll want to go through and make sure that your titles adhere to that style guide specification. Now notice in the index terms, we have an entry, a top level index entry of cluster, and we also have one of clusters. And it's not uncommon when you're indexing to introduce slight variations like this, which means that your index is not going to sort as cleanly as you would like. And it's often difficult to discover these things without doing a content inventory. So you would want to decide whether you're going to use singular or plural here and go with whatever your decision is. And a little farther here to the right, you can see that in the conditions used, we've got several of the maps that are using the props attribute. Now, strictly speaking, in the DITA world, props is intended for specializing other attributes. And really, it shouldn't be used directly because it's not semantically significant. So now that you've seen this kind of thing in your inventory, you might consider changing it to product or some other appropriate filtering attribute, or specializing an attribute if that's appropriate to do. And just a couple more things, a little farther down here. You can see that this Thunderbird user guide DITA map references both an images keys DITA map and an images to keys DITA map. Now, I happen to know that these two maps, images and images to keys, are key definition maps. And so I would want to, because I wasn't familiar with this content, I wanted to go and discover why this map would reference both and make sure that that was appropriate. And I looked at the two and I saw that they did indeed define the same keys, just with different values. So to figure out how that was used, I just took a look at the content, and I can see in my map here, the Thunderbird User Guide DITA map, that there are two topic groups here. And the first topic group references images keys, and the second topic group references images to keys, but they have different product attributes, STA and STB. And from this, I can infer that a DITA val is going to be applied, that one or the other topic group is going to be filtered out, and the appropriate set of key definitions is going to be the one that stays and is referenced, and to which all of the keys are resolved. So this makes perfect sense in that context. But again, I was clued into this particular structure by doing the inventory, so I could see what was going on there. Now, a note about keys: they can make it a little more difficult to inventory, or challenging, I should say, because references such as cross-references, images, in any kind of reference can be dependent on the key. So you can't absolutely say topic X cross-references topic Y. It may sometimes also cross-reference topic Z, depending on what the definition of the key referenced by the cross-reference is. So instead, you can note that, a certain image is referenced by certain keys. Then you look to see where those keys are referenced, and you follow the path. So for example, I can see that error icon ping is referenced by this key here, error icon, in my images key map, and also by, the other way around. This key, error icon, sometimes references this image and sometimes references this image, depending on the key map that is being referenced. So you have to record the path and follow the whole path, which is why I have a separate keys tab in this spreadsheet where I've listed all of my keys, all of their potential values, and where all of those values are set or defined. So if you use keys extensively, you're probably going to have to do a list like this, because you want to be aware of all of your keys, and you want to be aware where those keys are defined and what the potential definitions are. So you can search for redundancies, you can search for inconsistencies and things like that just within your key inventory. Now, returning to the content itself, at the very right, following all of my inventory columns, then I have my RACU criteria. So you'll see relevance, accuracy, completeness, conformance, uniqueness. And each of these, I just decided on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very good and 1 being no, fail, as it were. You can choose another scale or notation, obviously, whatever works for you. Uniqueness is a yes or no rating, because I'm a unique purist, so content is either unique or not. It can't be a little bit unique or really unique, so this is yes or no. And if the response is no, then there is a column in the spreadsheet where you can record any objects that are duplicates or near duplicates of the one you're evaluating. So after the audit is complete and the content remediation has begun, and I should note that this is not really a rating for Thunderbird. I don't know anything about the Thunderbird product, so I can't rate my content against it, obviously, in reality. So these numbers are arbitrary, just to show you an example. But clearly, you can really evaluate your content against your product, so you'll have realistic numbers. So after the audit's complete and you've started your content remediation, Each object and its potential duplicates, if you've recorded those, can be evaluated together to determine what you need to do. So maybe you can keep one and totally throw away the others. Or maybe they're a little bit different and you really need to take them all and combine them into one master topic or one master image or something to go forward with. And if you do that, and you've eliminated the duplicates, but you have references to those duplicates, then obviously you're going to need to refactor those references to point to your new go forward object. And any object that got less than a 4 for any other RACU query criteria should be earmarked for further evaluation and correction. And 4 is my choice. If this were my scale, I would say 4. It may be that your time or other limitations say, well, we're going to be satisfied with 3. Whatever works for you. And finally, there's the RACU risk column, where you can note any objects that are likely to backslide and will need to be reevaluated during a rolling audit going forward. So this is where you would earmark those topics.
Thanks, Leigh. So I'm just going to switch the screen back here. All right. So what tools are available for gathering all of this information in the first place?
Well, depending on the format of your content, there might be some out-of-the-box tools available, or you might have to create your own tools or scripts. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through a list now, but we've provided some options here in the slides that you'll receive at the end of the webinar. If you haven't downloaded the spreadsheet from the handout section, then we'll provide a link to that as well. So we're going to make these materials available to you. And if you have any other questions about tools or anything like that, please feel free to ask. We'll do our best to point you in the right direction. And that's all I have to say today about content inventories and audits. Well, actually, I have much more I could say, but this is all I have time to say. So thank you very much for your attention and interest.
Thank you very much to you, Leigh. So we'll be starting our questions section now, and we'll start with the first question, which is, how do you know which content to mark as RACU risk for the future?
Well, that really depends on what you find during the inventory. So let's say that, like most companies, you have undergone rebranding or terminology changes and things like that. And it's sometimes hard to make sure you've caught everything or applied everything. So if you have content that you see is heavily branded or uses terminology that frequently changes or anything like that, you could mark that as RACU risk, because it's very possible that that will slip through the net again in the future, and that terminology might get re-outdated. That's not really a word, but it is now. Basically, the nature of the content kind of determines that.
Okay, so our next question is, our experience is that a manual audit is paramount to a complete review of the inventory and overwhelming to 99% of organizations. What are your thoughts of automated tools as a first pass, implementing simplified technical English and harmonizer to find identical, similar, and unique content?
I think you should absolutely take advantage of those first pass tools. And yes, if you're using simplified technical English, then you've really got a leg up on the process, because you are evaluating a known and fixed set of rules and terms. So the key here, and that's a good point, is that the more you can employ standards, be it simplified technical English, be it structured authoring, be it anything like that already has its own set of rules that it imposes, the better off you are, because you will have a set of those rules you can evaluate against. And in many cases, the standard itself, such as DITA, can be sort of self-checking. In other words, you know that if you're using DITA, that all of your content at least is structurally correct, it has to adhere to this particular standard, or it won't even be, you won't be able to publish it. Other tools will be checking for you. So the more standardized you can be with your content, and the more you can lean towards using an established standard, the better off you are. It's one less thing that you have to, you're not so dependent on the authors to self-govern.
Right. So we've got another question here. How would you approach a pre-DITA conversion content inventory differently compared to this example using content already in DITA? For example, my company has 3,000 manuals in unstructured FrameMaker.
Well, I have done an unstructured FrameMaker inventory, and I would start in the same place. I mean, I would start with a simple list of everything I have, every frame book, every file, every image, and so forth. And I would list, okay, what is in each book? How do these books go together? What book produces what deliverable? Are there cross-references between the books? Within each file, what images does this file use? Are there cross-references between files? So that basic mechanism is the same. Once you get to that point, then you can still do your evaluation, the RACU criteria. But I understand that just producing that initial list of files and books can be very daunting. The good news, maybe it's good news, I'm not sure, depending, is that Frame has a file format called, I believe it's .mif, which is an XML rendering of the book and the topics and all of that. And if you have someone who can process those MIF files with some XSL and extract all these lists of things, the lists of books, the list of references in the books, and so forth, then you can avoid the need to go through by hand and compile that list. But the information you need to record is largely the same. You need to know everything you have and its relationship to all your other objects. And sometimes that can be a very time-consuming task.
Thanks, Leigh. We have one more question here. Should an inventory or audit focus on different aspects of the content depending on why you're doing it?
It should. So if you're doing for example, if you're cleaning up, if you're not changing format, let's say your content is already in DITA and you're just preparing it for an import into a content management system, something like that, then your inventory will really need to focus probably more on relationships between objects, because unless you are able to sit down and at one time import every single thing in one fell swoop, you're probably going to do iterative imports. And at least in the case of the IXIASOFT CCMS, when you import objects, all of the references and everything get refactored to a particular CCMS format, file names and all of that. And it's very possible that in subsequent imports, you may be importing something that you imported the first time, because maybe it's a topic that's used in multiple maps or something. Well, you're going to need to know all the maps that topic is used in, because you're going to need to know if that topic has already been imported into the CCMS as part of a previous import. So you can mark it and say, don't re-import this topic, just overwrite the one that's already there. So the relationships are going to be very important for CCMS type imports. For localization, the criteria might be, a little bit different, and I'm not a localization expert. If you're doing a conversion, let's say from some other format to DITA, again, you're going to want to know the relationships between the objects, because you're going to want to know how to reestablish those relationships, what tools are available, and a lot of applications like Frame or Word, for example, don't have all of the same reuse mechanisms that DITA does. So objects that are reused or objects that haven't been reused, they've been sort of copied and pasted, you're going to want to identify those instances so you will know what DITA reuse mechanism you can best take advantage of to reproduce that relationship.
Okay, so we actually have one more question, and then we'll be wrapping up the presentation. So our last question for the day is, some initial keep criteria I'm looking at include 5-year retention requirement, reuse potential, end of service life. What other criteria should we consider as part of our inventory? We have 100,000 assets, Word, PDF, text, PowerPoint, across multiple storage locations. Most of it is legacy and not DITA.
Oh, good question. Well, let's see. For keep, obviously, your end of life is very important. And that goes into, relevance. So when obviously you're setting a 5-year sort of arbitrary check limit, I guess. I assume if something is still relevant after 5 years, you'd keep it. You wouldn't just necessarily kick it to the curb just because 5 years had gone by. Yeah, I think that, yeah, essentially, I mean, is it the criteria themselves? So is it still relevant? I mean, does it still address a product that is actively being sold and supported by your organization? And is it still accurate? Does it still, is it targeted to some older version of your product that's maybe at its end of life? Yeah, this isn't a very good answer, but I think that, yeah, I mean that by if you use the RACU criteria and you evaluate against it and you get a string of yeses for each of these things, then obviously that's a keeper. If you get a string of no's, that's not a keeper. And if you get something in between, a 2, 3, then that's, evaluating this, saying, okay, can I rehabilitate this topic? Can I make it relevant? Or has it since been replaced by something that's more relevant and more useful? But I think if you just evaluate the content on its own merits by these criteria, or maybe others, then I think you'll get a good picture of what to keep, what to archive, and what to rehabilitate.
So thank you very much, Leigh. That's it for our questions for today. And that's it for our presentation as well. I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in to our 3rd IXIAtalks webinar. And Leigh, again, thanks so much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been great. Our next webinar, Reuse Metrics, is scheduled for March 5th, 2019, and will feature a special guest from Ericsson, Sari Eklund, including IXIASOFT's Senior Data Content Strategist, Keith Shangili-Roberts, who was featured in an earlier IXIAtalks webinar. So follow us on Twitter, check out our website, and stay in touch for updates. And if you would like to be featured in one of our webinars or have a unique topic idea, please get in touch at team.ccms@ixiasoft.com. We'll see you in March.